Imagine you're walking everywhere you go. Every hunt, every move to follow the buffalo herds, every escape from enemies all on foot. Your entire world exists within the distance your legs can carry you in a day. Then one morning, you see an animal that will change everything. Not just your hunting methods or your travel speed, but your entire conception of power, distance, and possibility itself. This is the story of how the Lakota people transformed from pedestrian hunters into arguably the finest light cavalry the world has ever seen. It's about the moment when Spanish horses, escaped or stolen from colonial settlements, began drifting north across the Great Plains in the 1600s. And it's about what happens when a culture embraces revolutionary technology so completely that it rewrites the rules of warfare for an entire continent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The horse reached the Lakota sometime in the late 1600s, though pinpointing the exact decade is difficult. What we do know is this. The Spanish brought horses to the Americas starting in the 1500s, and those horses gradually made their way north through trade networks, escape, and theft. By the time the Lakota encountered them, horses had already transformed other plains cultures. But the Lakota took to mounted warfare with an intensity that would define them for the next 2 centuries. Think about the learning curve here. These weren't horses as we might imagine them from European cavalry tradition, heavily armored destriers trained for shock combat. These were smaller, hardier animals descended from Spanish stock, perfectly suited to the plains environment. And the Lakota weren't trying to replicate European tactics. They were inventing something entirely new. A Lakota warrior could shoot arrows accurately while riding at full gallop. Let that sink in for a moment. Not trotting, not cantering full gallop. They could slide down the side of a horse, using the animal's body as a moving shield while firing under its neck. They developed a relationship with their mounts that went beyond simple riding. Young boys would start training on horseback at ages when European children were still learning to walk properly in their formal shoes. The spiritual dimension mattered too. Horses weren't just tools or livestock. They were partners, sometimes considered more valuable than human life in the brutal calculations of warfare. A warrior's relationship with his horse carried religious significance. Ceremonies blessed both rider and mount before battle. Horse medicine became a distinct category of spiritual knowledge, with certain individuals recognized as having special power to heal or communicate with these animals. But here's where it gets interesting from a military perspective. The horse didn't just make the Lakota faster, it fundamentally altered the strategic geography of the Great Plains. Suddenly, a war party could strike 200 miles from their home camp and return before anyone realized they'd left. Buffalo herds that once required weeks of careful stalking on foot could now be approached, hunted, and harvested with devastating efficiency. A people who had stored food for lean times could now simply move to where food existed. The coup system evolved alongside mounted warfare. Counting coup touching an enemy in battle without killing him was the highest military honor. It required getting close enough to reach out and strike an opponent with a coup stick or your hand. On horseback, this became a thunderous game of chicken, warriors racing past enemy lines close enough to touch. The bravest didn't even carry weapons on coup runs, they carried sticks. The humiliation inflicted on an enemy was worth more than his death. Warrior societies formalized around mounted combat. The Kit Fox Society, the Strong Heart Society, the Crow Owners, each had specific roles, specific tactics, specific songs. These weren't just military units, they were social structures that bound young men together, taught them the arts of war, regulated their behavior, and gave them identity. A warrior earned his place through demonstrated courage. No one inherited battlefield authority. You proved it on horseback or you didn't prove it at all. Women's roles shifted too, though this often gets lost in histories focused solely on male warriors. Managing a horse herd required constant attention. Someone had to track breeding, identify the best animals for war versus travel, maintain pastures, and handle the practical logistics of moving dozens or hundreds of horses with a mobile camp. Lakota women became experts in horse husbandry, making strategic decisions about which animals to keep, trade, or cull. Some women raided for horses themselves. The romantic notion of the Wild West often misses how integrated and interdependent these societies actually were. Horse raiding became its own art form. Young men earned status by stealing horses from enemy tribes. The Crow and Pawnee were favorite targets. These weren't random acts of theft. They were carefully planned military operations requiring scouting, coordination, and split-second timing. A successful raid could make a young warrior's reputation. A failed raid could end his life. The horses themselves became a currency of respect, given as gifts, offered as bride prices, distributed to demonstrate generosity. The economic transformation was equally profound. Control of the buffalo-rich heartland of North America meant controlling the most valuable resource on the plains. Buffalo provided everything: food, shelter, clothing, tools, ceremonial objects. A people with horses could harvest buffalo at scales impossible for pedestrian hunters. They could process more meat, tan more hides, create surplus for trade. The Lakota became wealthy by the standards of their world, and wealth translated to military power. By the early 1800s, the Lakota had established themselves as the dominant force across a vast territory stretching from present-day Minnesota to Montana, from the Canadian border south into Nebraska. They'd pushed the Crow westward, defeated the Pawnee repeatedly, and established themselves as the military power that other tribes feared and respected. This wasn't accidental. This was the result of a complete cultural adaptation to mounted warfare over several generations. But here's the thing about becoming the dominant military power in your region. You don't stay dominant forever. Someone always comes along with greater numbers, better technology, or more desperate motivation. And in the 1860s, that someone was about to arrive in force, bringing with them a fundamentally different vision of what the Great Plains should become and who should control them. The collision between Lakota cavalry culture and American westward expansion wouldn't be a meeting of equals seeking compromise. It would be a clash between two peoples who saw the world in completely incompatible ways. And for a brief, remarkable moment, the Lakota would prove that superior mobility and tactical skill could defeat a numerically superior enemy equipped with industrial-age weapons. But that moment was coming, and when it arrived, the thunder of hoofbeats would shake the foundations of American military confidence. The 1860s brought a peculiar problem to the American frontier. The Civil War had just ended, producing thousands of battle-hardened veterans and officers who needed employment. The solution seemed obvious: send them west to secure the territories, protect settlers, and establish American authority over the Great Plains. The army assumed this would be straightforward. After all, they'd just fought the bloodiest war in American history. How difficult could it be to manage what they viewed as scattered bands of primitive warriors? They were about to receive a comprehensive education in humiliation. Red Cloud was not a hereditary chief. He'd earned his position through demonstrated courage and tactical brilliance in dozens of raids against the Crow and Pawnee. By the 1860s, he was in his 40s, experienced, strategic, and deeply aware that American expansion threatened everything the Lakota had built. The Bozeman Trail, cutting through prime Lakota hunting territory to reach Montana goldfields, represented an existential threat. Not because of the trail itself, but because of what it represented: American assumption that they could simply take what they wanted. The Army built 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail: Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith. Their mission was to protect travelers and assert American control. Fort Phil Kearny, the largest, sat in the heart of Lakota territory near present-day Wyoming. The commanding officer, Colonel Henry Carrington, was a competent administrator but had never fought Native Americans. He was about to learn why battlefield experience in the Civil War didn't translate to warfare on the plains. December 21st, 1866. Remember that date. Captain William Fetterman commanded a relief force of 80 men, infantry and cavalry combined. A wood-gathering party had come under attack near the fort, and Fetterman received orders to relieve them. Carrington's instructions were explicit: do not pursue beyond Lodge Trail Ridge, do not chase the attackers out of sight of the fort, relieve the wood party and return. Fetterman had different ideas. He'd reportedly said he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with 80 men. This wasn't mere bravado, it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of who he was fighting. In the Civil War, soldiers stood in lines and shot at each other. Courage and discipline won battles. On the plains, courage without tactical awareness just got you killed faster. Red Cloud had spent weeks studying the fort's routines, the soldiers' responses, the terrain. He knew exactly how American officers thought. They were aggressive. They pursued attackers. They assumed numerical parity meant battlefield advantage. He was about to use all of that against them. A small group of warriors attacked the wood party. Fetterman's force rode out. Young warriors, including a Lakota named Crazy Horse, who would later become legendary, appeared on Lodge Trail Ridge, just close enough to provoke pursuit. They taunted the soldiers, made insulting gestures, seemed vulnerable. Fetterman took the bait. He crossed the ridge, moving out of sight of the fort, directly against orders. Behind Lodge Trail Ridge, 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors waited in hidden positions. Not in a single group that would be too obvious. They were dispersed in ravines, behind rocks, in terrain that looked empty but concealed overwhelming force. The decoy warriors led Fetterman's command directly into this killing ground. What happened next lasted less than 40 minutes. The warriors struck from multiple directions simultaneously. Fetterman's infantry formed a defensive circle on a small rise Civil War tactics. But this wasn't the Civil War. Mounted warriors circled them constantly, firing arrows and rifles, never staying still long enough to present a target. The cavalry tried to charge and got separated from the infantry. Individual units found themselves surrounded, overwhelmed. The Lakota and their allies didn't just kill Fetterman's command, they annihilated them. 81 men died. Not one survived to describe what happened. When the relief force finally reached the site the next day, they found bodies stripped, mutilated according to warrior tradition, scattered across the hillside. The scene shocked even veterans of Civil War battlefields. Here's what the Fetterman massacre, though the Lakota would call it the Battle of the 100 in the Hands, revealed. First, numerical advantage meant nothing if you couldn't bring it to bear. Second, mobility trumped firepower when warriors controlled the terrain and timing. Third, the Lakota weren't primitive savages, conducting random raids. They were executing sophisticated military operations with strategic objectives. The army's response was predictable: more forts, more soldiers, more supplies. But Red Cloud understood something profound about asymmetric warfare. He didn't need to win every battle. He needed to make occupation unbearably expensive in American lives and money. Every supply wagon that had to fight its way through, every wood party that needed armed escort, every patrol that ventured out wondering if this was the day they'd ride into an ambush. This was war as slow strangulation. The cultural gulf made negotiation nearly impossible. Americans thought in terms of property ownership: this land belongs to us because we claimed it, bought it, conquered it. The Lakota thought in terms of relationship: we belong to this land because our ancestors are buried here, because the buffalo live here, because the sacred places are here. When Americans talked about buying land, Lakota leaders struggled to understand what was being sold. You can't sell your mother, you can't purchase the sky. Time itself was understood differently. Americans saw history as linear: past, present, future, marching in sequence toward progress. The Lakota experienced time as circular seasons returning, buffalo migrations repeating, generations living and dying in patterns that connected them to ancestors and descendants. Treaty negotiations floundered on these fundamental disconnects. American negotiators thought they were purchasing permanent ownership. Lakota leaders thought they were agreeing to temporary sharing arrangements that could be renegotiated as circumstances changed. The army launched winter campaigns, hoping to catch Lakota camps vulnerable in deep snow. But winter on the plains was brutal for both sides, and the Lakota knew how to survive it. Campaigns ended with frost-bitten soldiers retreating to their forts while warriors continued harassing supply lines. The mathematics of occupation became impossible. It cost more to maintain the forts than the gold fields generated. Soldiers died protecting a trail that fewer travelers wanted to use because it was so dangerous. By 1868, the American government faced an unusual situation. They were losing. Not losing individual battles necessarily, but losing the strategic war. Fort Phil Kearny was under such constant siege that it functioned more as a prison for its garrison than a projection of American power. Red Cloud had achieved something remarkable. He'd made American occupation untenable through pure military pressure. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed in April 1868, represented American capitulation. The Army agreed to abandon the 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail. They agreed to recognize Lakota sovereignty over vast territories, including the Black Hills. Red Cloud wouldn't even attend the negotiations until he saw smoke from the burning forts. In August 1868, he got his wish. Warriors set Fort Phil Kearny ablaze while the last soldiers marched away in retreat. Think about what that meant. The United States military, fresh from defeating the Confederacy, officially admitted defeat and abandoned claimed territory to native forces. This was the only time in the 19th century this happened. Red Cloud had won his war, but victory carried a shadow that Red Cloud and his warriors couldn't fully see yet. The treaty was written in English, with clauses and provisions that meant different things to different signatories. The Black Hills were guaranteed to the Lakota for as long as the grass shall grow and the water shall flow, a promise that sounded eternal but rested on American respect for written agreements. And American respect for treaties with native peoples had a troubling track record. More immediately, Red Cloud's victory had demonstrated something dangerous. It showed that superior tactics, knowledge of terrain, and warrior courage could defeat American military power. Other Lakota leaders took note. Younger warriors saw proof that resistance was possible. The message spread across the plains the Americans could be beaten. This victory wouldn't last. It couldn't last. But for this brief moment in 1868, watching Fort Phil Kearny burn, Lakota warriors could believe they'd secured their future. They'd proven themselves militarily superior. They'd forced American recognition of their sovereignty. They'd won. What they didn't know was that winning this battle had marked them for a war of total destruction. The American government had learned from Red Cloud's victory too. They'd learned that conventional military operations weren't enough. They'd need to destroy not just warriors, but the entire economic and cultural foundation that produced those warriors. That realization would shape everything that came next, and the next phase of conflict would introduce a new element that would briefly shift the balance even further in the Lakota's favor: superior weapons. Here's something that doesn't fit the typical narrative about Native American warfare by the mid-1870s. Many Lakota warriors carried better rifles than the United States Army cavalry they were fighting. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about a technological disadvantage being overcome through courage and tactics. We're talking about actual firepower superiority. And that changes everything about how we understand what happened at Little Bighorn. The repeating rifle, specifically the Winchester and Henry models, represented a quantum leap in battlefield effectiveness. A soldier with a single-shot Springfield carbine, which most cavalry carried, could fire maybe 10 to 12 aimed shots per minute under ideal conditions. A warrior with a Henry rifle could fire 28 rounds as fast as he could work the lever. That's not a marginal advantage. That's overwhelming fire superiority at the individual level. But acquiring these weapons created profound problems for Lakota society. These weren't weapons you could make. Every rifle, every cartridge, came from the American industrial system. Getting them required trade, which meant dealing with merchants who operated in legal and illegal markets. Some weapons came through official channels. Government annuity payments sometimes included older model rifles. Some came through black market traders willing to sell anything for profit. Some came from raids, captured from dead soldiers, or stolen from poorly guarded supply depots. The spiritual crisis this created shouldn't be underestimated. Traditional Lakota warfare involved weapons that were extensions of the warrior bows crafted by hand, arrows blessed in ceremony, coup sticks that represented personal courage. A rifle was foreign technology, created by enemies, dependent on supply chains completely outside Lakota control. Some elders argued that adopting enemy weapons meant accepting enemy ways, that it represented a spiritual corruption that would weaken the people. Younger warriors saw it differently. They'd fought soldiers armed with repeating rifles. They'd watched friends die because they carried single-shot weapons or bows against rapid-fire carbines. Practical necessity trumped spiritual purity. If the enemy brought rifles, you brought better rifles. The debate never fully resolved. It just became irrelevant as circumstances forced choices. Ammunition presented even bigger problems. You could capture a rifle easily enough, but cartridges? Each shot required a precisely manufactured brass case, gunpowder, primer, and bullet. When ammunition ran out, the rifle became an awkward club. Warriors developed elaborate trading networks to secure cartridges. They reloaded spent cases when they could find the materials. They hoarded every round, calculating when firepower superiority justified expenditure versus when traditional weapons made more sense. The tactical revolution this enabled was profound. In the wagon box fight of August 1867, 32 soldiers armed with breech-loading Springfield rifles held off hundreds of Lakota warriors for hours. The warriors had expected soldiers armed with muzzle loaders, weapons that required time to reload and rendered the shooter vulnerable. Instead, they faced sustained rapid fire that broke traditional tactics. The Lakota learned from that disaster. If rapid-fire weapons changed the battlefield that dramatically, they needed rapid-fire weapons themselves. By 1876, many Lakota warriors had acquired Winchesters, Henrys, and various other repeating rifles through years of trade and capture. The Battle of the Rosebud in June 1876 demonstrated their effectiveness. 1,200 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors fought 1,300 soldiers and allied Crow and Shoshone scouts to a standstill. General George Crook, commanding the army force, withdrew after suffering significant casualties. Warrior fire discipline and superior individual marksmanship countered American numerical advantages. 8 days later came Little Bighorn. June 25, 1876. The battle that would make Custer a legend and prove that technological superiority, even temporary, could produce devastating results. The numbers matter here. Custer commanded about 600 men of the 7th Cavalry. He divided them into 3 battalions, a decision that military historians still debate. He kept 5 companies, roughly 210 men, under his direct command. The Lakota and Cheyenne village he attacked contained somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 warriors, possibly more. Estimates vary, but what's not in dispute is that Custer was significantly outnumbered and didn't know it. More importantly, he was outgunned. Custer's men carried single-shot Springfield carbines, effective weapons but slow to reload, prone to jamming when overheated, and limited in sustained fire capability. Many warriors in the village carried repeating rifles, Winchesters, Henrys, and various other models acquired over years. When Custer's battalion moved into position along what's now called Custer Hill, they faced enemies with superior firepower at close range. The battle itself was chaos, not the organized clash of massed formations, but dozens of individual firefights happening simultaneously across broken terrain. Custer's men tried to form defensive positions, but mounted warriors circled them constantly, firing from moving horses, never staying still enough to provide clear targets. The carbines jammed. Soldiers struggled to extract spent cartridges. Warriors with repeating rifles maintained sustained fire. Contemporary accounts from native participants describe the sound a rolling thunder of gunfire that never stopped, like continuous storm. Smoke from black powder weapons created a fog across the battlefield. Horses screamed and fell. Men died trying to reload or clear jammed weapons. The engagement that destroyed Custer's immediate command took perhaps 45 minutes to an hour. 210 men died. Not one survived. The other battalions of the 7th Cavalry, under Major Reno and Captain Benteen, were pinned down separately and survived only by establishing defensive positions and holding until reinforcements arrived 2 days later. Even then, warriors maintained fire superiority. Reno's survivors described warriors armed with the most modern weapons, firing from covered positions with accuracy that kept soldiers pinned for hours. Here's what Little Bighorn proved: superior weapons in the hands of skilled warriors operating on familiar terrain could absolutely destroy regular army forces. This wasn't primitive people getting lucky. This was a military victory achieved through better equipment, superior tactics, and warrior skill. The Lakota and Cheyenne fighters at Little Bighorn demonstrated fire discipline, coordinated movement, and tactical flexibility that would impress any military professional. But victory carried a terrible price that wouldn't become clear for months. The American public responded to Custer's death with outrage and demands for vengeance. The army, humiliated, received authorization to pursue total war. The brief moment of technological parity was ending. The federal government committed resources that would dwarf anything previously deployed against native peoples. More fundamentally, the dependency on captured or traded weapons created a strategic trap. Every cartridge fired at Little Bighorn was one fewer cartridge in reserve. There was no Lakota ammunition factory, no supply chain that could match American industrial output. Warriors who'd proven they could outfight the army rifle for rifle still faced the mathematics of industrial warfare: unlimited production versus limited capture. The spiritual compromise involved in adopting enemy technology also extracted costs. Traditional warrior societies had bound young men together through shared ceremonies, shared values, shared ways of proving courage. Rifles changed what made someone a successful warrior. Marksmanship mattered more than the ability to count coup. Access to ammunition became as important as courage. The old ways and new ways coexisted uneasily. Still, for this brief window in the mid-1870s, the Lakota achieved something remarkable. They'd adapted enemy technology successfully enough to defeat the enemy in open battle. They'd proven that native peoples could match American military power when the playing field was even. Little Bighorn entered history as Custer's last stand, but it was really a demonstration of Lakota military capability at its absolute peak. The question that warriors couldn't answer, standing over the bodies of Custer's command in the fading light of June 25th, was what came next. They'd won the greatest Native American military victory of the 19th century. They'd humiliated the army. They'd proven their tactical and technological sophistication. And all of that was about to become irrelevant in the face of strategic realities they couldn't overcome through courage or superior rifles. The Americans weren't going to send more soldiers to fight fair battles. They were going to destroy the foundation of Lakota existence itself systematically, deliberately, with industrial efficiency. The buffalo were about to die, and with them, any hope of continued resistance. There's a photograph from 1874 showing a pile of buffalo skulls stacked higher than a man can reach, stretching back so far the camera can't capture the end. 30,000 skulls waiting to be ground into fertilizer. One photograph among thousands documenting the systematic destruction of the largest terrestrial animal populations on Earth. This wasn't hunting. This was industrial extermination with explicit military purpose. General Philip Sheridan said it plainly: "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." He understood what some army officers took years to grasp: you couldn't defeat the Lakota by killing warriors. Warriors could be replaced. Every young man who came of age became a potential fighter. But destroy the buffalo, and you destroyed food, shelter, clothing, tools, trade goods, and cultural identity in one stroke. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. In 1800, perhaps 30 to 60 million, buffalo ranged across the Great Plains. By 1880, fewer than 1,000 remained. Professional hunters, armed with long-range Sharps rifles, could kill 50 to 100 animals per day. They took the hides and left the carcasses to rot. The Great Plains became a vast charnel house, the air thick with the smell of decay, the ground littered with bones as far as anyone could see. Lakota warriors watched this happening and understood exactly what it meant. They attacked hunting parties when they could, but what could mounted warriors do against men who shot from hundreds of yards away, who operated in groups with supporting wagons and armed guards? The hunters were doing work no army could accomplish, making Lakota independence physically impossible. By the late 1870s, the strategic situation was mathematically unsolvable. 20,000 Lakota faced a United States population of 50 million. An industrial economy that produced millions of rifle cartridges annually faced a subsistence economy that could only acquire ammunition through trade or capture. Unlimited reinforcements faced irreplaceable losses. Telegraph lines connected army posts, coordinating movements across vast distances, while Lakota communication moved at the speed of horses. The army launched winter campaigns with singular purpose: find Lakota camps when people couldn't easily move, when horses were weak from lack of forage, when families were vulnerable. They didn't seek honorable battle. They sought destruction of capacity to resist, burn the lodges, scatter the horse herds, destroy the food supplies, turn military conflict into survival crisis. One by one, the great war leaders faced impossible choices. Sitting Bull took his followers to Canada, but found that sanctuary offered only slow starvation. Canadian buffalo herds were already decimated. The Canadian government provided minimal support and made clear the Lakota weren't welcome permanently. In 1881, Sitting Bull surrendered at Fort Buford, an old man who'd once commanded thousands. Crazy Horse, the warrior who'd helped destroy Custer, surrendered at Fort Robinson in May 1877. 4 months later, soldiers killed him during a scuffle, bayoneted in the back while being held by a former comrade who'd become an army scout. The symbolism was perfect: Lakota warriors, desperate for any way to survive, taking pay from the army to track down their own people. The ghost dance movement emerged from this desperation. A Paiute prophet named Wovoka preached that performing certain dances and ceremonies would restore the dead, return the buffalo, and make the white men disappear. The movement spread across reservations in the late 1880s, offering hope through spiritual means when military resistance had become impossible. People danced because they had nothing else left. The army viewed ghost dancing as preparation for uprising. At Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, tensions escalated through December 1890. Sitting Bull was killed during an arrest attempt on December 15th. His death sent shock waves through communities already stretched to breaking point. Hundreds of Lakota, mostly families following Chief Bigfoot, fled toward Pine Ridge seeking protection. The 7th Cavalry-Killers Old Regiment, carrying institutional memory of Little Bighorn, intercepted Bigfoot's band at Wounded Knee Creek on December 28th. The soldiers set up 4 Hotchkiss guns on the surrounding hills. Hotchkiss guns were rapid-fire artillery pieces that fired explosive shells. Pointing them at a camp of cold, hungry, mostly unarmed people was overkill, bordering on murder setup. On December 29, 1890, soldiers began disarming the Lakota. Exactly what triggered the shooting remains disputed. A deaf man named Black Coyote allegedly raised his rifle skyward, saying he'd paid good money for it and wouldn't surrender it. Maybe a shot was fired accidentally. Maybe a soldier panicked. What's not disputed is what happened next. The Hotchkiss guns opened fire into the camp. They fired shells that exploded on impact, shredding anything nearby. Soldiers fired into lodges where women and children huddled. The killings spread across the frozen ground. Some Lakota fought back with whatever weapons they'd hidden or grabbed. Most ran. Soldiers pursued fleeing families, shooting them down in ravines and gullies up to 2 miles from the camp. When the guns finally fell silent, approximately 300 Lakota lay dead, 2/3 of them women and children. 25 soldiers died, many killed by friendly fire in the chaos. A blizzard moved in that night, covering the bodies in snow. 3 days later, burial parties found infants still alive, frozen to their dead mothers' bodies. They found a 4-month-old wearing a beaded cap with an American flag design. 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for Wounded Knee, the highest military decoration the United States could award, given for a massacre of unarmed women and children. That tells you everything about how the government viewed what had happened not as a war crime, but as the necessary final chapter in a military campaign. The armed resistance was over, not because the Lakota lost courage or military skill, but because the mathematical realities were insurmountable. You cannot fight a war when your enemy can produce unlimited ammunition, and you cannot. You cannot sustain resistance when your food source has been deliberately exterminated. You cannot maintain independence when your population is outnumbered 2,000 to 1, and the gap widens every year through disease, malnutrition, and deliberate military action. But here's what the United States military and government never managed to destroy: the memory, the stories. The cultural identity that survived through language, ceremony, and deliberate transmission across generations. Lakota warriors became army scouts, yes, but they also became storytellers, keeping alive the accounts of victories and defeats, tactics and courage, the time when their people controlled the Great Plains through superior horsemanship and warrior skill. Their descendants served in every American war of the 20th century. Lakota soldiers fought in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They served with distinction, earning decorations and respect. The warrior tradition didn't die at Wounded Knee. It transformed, finding new expression in different contexts. Modern Lakota communities preserve the language, teach the history, maintain the ceremonies. They've fought legal battles to recover the Black Hills, to protect sacred sites, to maintain treaty rights. The cavalry that once dominated the Great Plains lives in memory and in the careful preservation of knowledge about mounted warfare, warrior societies, and a time when being Lakota meant something that could make empires reconsider their assumptions. The greatest light cavalry in history achieved a kind of immortality through defeat, not the comfortable immortality of victors writing triumphant histories, but the harder immortality of people who refused to let their story be erased. Every account of Little Bighorn, every study of plains warfare, every discussion of asymmetric conflict references what the Lakota accomplished in their brief century of mounted dominance. They proved that tactical brilliance and individual courage matter, even when strategic mathematics make victory impossible. They demonstrated that Native American peoples weren't primitive obstacles to progress, but sophisticated societies capable of adapting new technologies and developing military innovations that rivaled anything European cultures produced. They showed that resistance itself has value, that fighting impossible odds can preserve dignity and identity even in defeat. The mathematics of sunset were always going to win. 20,000 could never defeat 50 million. Subsistence hunting could never compete with industrial production. Limited geography could never match continental expansion. But for one remarkable period, from the arrival of horses in the 1600s through the last free days of the 1880s, the Lakota rewrote the rules of cavalry warfare and proved that sometimes the side with fewer numbers and less technology can still win battles. They just can't win the war. And knowing that, they fought anyway. That tells you everything about who they were and who their descendants remain.